So today's final opera from this series is Carmen, which is I'm fairly positive about this. Whenever I last checked, whenever that would have been, but it is pretty difficult to avoid this opera in particular, namely because it is not only one of the most, if not, I believe, the single most performed opera in the modern day, and really probably for all time. But it also contains one of the classic and best known femme fatales in opera, and I thought it would be appropriate to end with this monumental work. And it's interesting. It is very easy to sort of skip over this opera because of its familiarity, because of the fact that it has become so ingrained in our culture. It is so well known even to those who don't know that they know it, that it's sort of synonymous with Western art music and with opera. But there's a lot to unpack given the circumstances of the opera's creation, and especially during a pretty turbulent time in France's history. So to begin with, when we're talking about French opera, when we're talking about French history between 1825 to 75, there's a couple of things we need to take into context. So first of all, the rather important socioeconomic revolutions and upheavals that were happening around the time. Of course, there's the French Revolution from 1848, and there's the Paris Commune, the revolutionary government that took over in 1871. The question of class and the question of sort of the proto-Marxist proletariat ideology was sort of coming into formation, and especially with the Paris Commune. But the idea of sort of the lower class being a despised class was very important and very much on the minds of the elite, and this certainly would include people who would be going to the opera, people who would be writing for the opera, and was just generally a part of the zeitgeist during this time. Also important was the Franco-Prussian War, which is important because of the fact that it was such a humiliating defeat for the French. And what it meant was that there was a resound rejection of Germanic culture. And from the music world, what this meant was a rejection of Beethoven, a rejection of Wagner, especially Wagner, and anything that was sort of emulated or projected Germanic cultural values, Germanic musical values. All of this was verboten, to use an inappropriate word perhaps for this context. But that still being said, there are plenty of what were called Wagnerian, the sort of Wagner craze, French composers. I think of César Franck. I think of even to certain extents Debussy, who would later reject the Wagnerian model. Even Fauré, to certain extents, it can't be sort of separated from the extent of Wagner's influence. And not only this, but we have to bear in mind when it comes to Carmen, because of course Carmen, being a gypsy, this sort of constitutes as part of the racial aspect of Carmen and of the depiction of non-Western culture in opera. We have to remember that France was in the middle of exerting an enormous amount of control over Africa, Asia, the West, all of these various colonies that they had their fingers in a lot of pies. And this influences the way that the French think of themselves as a rational Western nation, and the countries outside or under their control, especially when we're going to be talking about Orientalism, when we consider the Middle East, when we consider North Africa, when we consider Spain, because they did consider Spain Eastern because of this sort of Moorish North African Arabic influence. These places that they would have considered barbaric, they would have considered almost sort of actually something to aspire towards, something to reflect themselves in. So these three elements are things that we have to consider when we are talking about French opera from this time. Now, there are three main types of opera that were being written when Bizet composed Carmen. The first of which is grand opera, which was championed most by Giacomo Meyerbeer. And there are a couple of things that sort of make sort of defining features of grand opera. First and foremost, it is grandiose. It really is grand in the largest possible concept. It was expensive. It was in 5 acts. It was usually historical in nature. There was always ballet, because ballet was an intrinsic part of French opera, because ballet is a French product, and was sort of tied since the Baroque era to French opera. And it was always just these lavish big productions, and it has fallen out of favor in the standard repertoire in the modern era. But the most famous and most frequently performed is Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, which is about a Protestant Catholic conflict from the early, I believe, I really need to check on this. I think it's the 15th century, but I'm not entirely sure about this. But it is a violent opera about this clash. And the scale is enormous, because we'll have, in this example I'm going to show, this intimate sort of wedding setting from the final act where a Protestant and a Catholic are marrying, and they are converting to the Protestant faith, and there's this sort of bass clarinet underpinning this intimate setting that then all of a sudden is broached by the incoming mob that's coming to kill them. what they are singing, the Huguenots are singing during this section is Martin Luther's Ein feste Burg, this famous hymn tune that was closely associated with Protestantism, and it is what they are singing as they are being massacred, as they're being shot to death. And so these are the sort of grand topics and grand subjects and grand ideas that grand opera deals with. So, on the other hand, we have there we go. On the other hand, we have operetta, which was championed by Jacques Offenbach, and this is quite the opposite of grand opera. It is light, it's satirical, it can often be bawdy, and it contains spoken dialogue, whereas grand opera would always be completely sung. You'd have recitative instead of spoken dialogue. So this is sort of a music hall, a lowbrow alternative to grand opera. And we're going to have a little excerpt from La Belle Hélène, which is a Greek subject from Greek history. And we're going to have a little excerpt from the end of Act 1, where the king is basically duped into leaving his own kingdom. So that is another alternative to that is an alternative to grand opera. And the final type that we have is the opera comique, which is related to the grand opera, and it actually used to fulfill the role that operetta did, in that it was sort of a commentary, a satirical version of what the grand opera was doing. But over time, it became much more conservative and was more aimed at the families of the bourgeoisie, sort of these middle class people who would be going. I should also mention that these various operas also, or rather types of opera, had distinct social classes that were assigned to them. So the grand opera was usually the upper middle class, the opera comique was usually the middle, and then the operetta was the lower middle class. The opera comique was best known, again, it's not a very popular genre outside of Carmen, which we'll get to in a second, but Adolphe Adam, Francois Adrien Beaulieu, these were some of the composers who would have written this kind of opera. Again, it's very similar to grand opera. However, as time went on, there was much more of this sort of what Bizet would come to sort of loathe, this sort of inane sentimentality, these excessively moral plots, these sort of meaningless happy endings. It's very sort of bland in a certain way. And here's an excerpt from an opera that Bizet particularly hated, La Dame Blanche, the Lady in White. I should actually mention that the opera comique is not only the genre of what this is, but it's also where it was performed. And the opera comique still exists today. But of course, it has a different set of priorities that it has, as different clientele, so on and so forth. Going on to Bizet. So Bizet was born in Paris, and he, from a very early age, was very precocious. He was admitted to the Conservatoire, where he studied with Charles Gounod, a famous opera and composer of choral works. Again, somebody who would have had his operas played at the Opera Comique, the Grand Opera, so on and so forth. He was close friends with Saint-Saëns, with whom he was fairly close in age, and he wound up winning the very prestigious Prix de Rome award, which was given to the finest composition student from the Conservatoire, and basically they were given a stipend to go to Rome and compose and to explore the city, which Bizet did. He was also a very accomplished pianist, and Franz Liszt actually was particularly complimentary with how he saw Bizet's performance. However, Bizet was not much of a performer. He sort of avoided public performance. And it's interesting. We can sort of consider, in a certain sense, Bizet as a bit of a one-hit wonder, because if it weren't for Carmen, his career as a composer would have certainly been not particularly noteworthy. His early operatic attempts, Le Péché de Pearl, the Pearl Fishes, La Joie de Perth, Jamilé, these are all sort of received with lukewarm reception, and are not particularly well regarded, even in by modern standards. Occasionally, the Pearl Fishes is performed, but generally speaking, not particularly noteworthy. Now that we have Carmen, obviously there's more of an interest in what preceded that, and more of a sort of an academic interest in understanding the composer prior. I should also mention that Bizet had a great deal of interest in this music hall, operetta music, lowbrow music, cabaret. And he also, to sort of make money on the side, would make arrangements of popular tunes for piano especially. And when it came to writing Carmen, the other operas he had written all contain sort of Orientalist fantasies. The Pesche de Pearl happens in India. Jamile is another Oriental fantasy, as it was termed. And the Carmen was to be no different. Again, sort of more of the Orientalist genre, which was very popular at the time. But what was unusual about Carmen, which we'll talk about more, is the fact that it violated the norms of the opera comique, of the conventions, the sort of very rigid conventions of what an opera was allowed to be if it was to be performed at on that stage. And as a result, not only did one of the directors of the Opera Comique resign, but the premiere was a complete failure. And it failed to capture the imagination of the French for about a decade. Whereas in the Austro-German realm, it was an enormous success. And Bizet actually died the same year of the premiere of Carmen in 1875, quite young, at the age of 36. And he never got to see his opera become a huge success. In fact, he sort of resigned himself to the fact that it would always be a failure. So let's talk about the origins of the Carmen story. And so the original novella was written by Prosper Mérimée, who was a writer and archaeologist from the early part of the 19th century. And it was written originally in 1845 in this literary magazine, the Revue des Deux Mondes, Review of Two Worlds. And it is actually told from the perspective of a French archaeologist. It's sort of supposed to be this kind of letter from abroad exploration of other civilizations. So this French archaeologist goes to Spain, where he encounters Carmen, where he encounters Don José, and sort of relays their story to the reader. And part of the point of this type of story, this type of sort of realist genre, was to provide a foil or a comparison to how the French viewed themselves, because the French were very much obsessed with their own history, with their own self-image, their idea of order and of sort of the rational sense, dispassionate understanding of themselves and of who they are, and especially comparing it to other nations that they did not see as having the same values, as being untamed, as being barbarian, as being violent, as being other. And this, again, as I mentioned, especially applied to the Middle East, North Africa, and as I mentioned, Spain. Again, Spain, because even though it is not part of the Middle East, it's part of Europe, it is thoroughly tainted or tinged with the Moorish, the Arabic, the Andalusian cultural elements or cultural artifacts that are so closely associated with this Orientalist school of thinking. And a big part of the original Mary May story is this question of control and power. It becomes what starts as this sort of archaeological expedition instead is suddenly taken over by Carmen, her sort of passionate tale. And it becomes a question in the story with who owns the story. And it's sort of doubled in many different ways. Who will own Carmen? Because what we see is that Carmen is sort of a danger to all men, regardless if they are French or Spanish, that men are ultimately all inadequate in her presence. And that ultimately Don José's murder of Carmen, which again happens in the opera just like the novella, is ultimately necessary to assert the control over this dangerous woman. And this type of misogynistic outlook is very common in this type of story, in this genre, and especially when it comes to this French idea of control and order, and especially comparison, not but just between the races, but also between the sexes. What is done to sort of adapt this story for the operatic stage, of course, is that we remove the narrator, and it becomes what is in Mary May's original a narrated story. In an opera, it becomes a depiction of events. In addition, the character of Michaela is added. She sort of provides a foil to Carmen, sort of the more chaste, domestic woman, as opposed to the flirtatious sexual Carmen. And then on top of that, in Mary May's original, Don José is this sort of outlaw, this brigand who is murdered, who is a thief. And instead, in the opera, he becomes this sort of innocent character whose downfall because of Carmen is to be pitied. Now, as I also mentioned, there's this idea of Orientalism that was sort of absolutely sort of consuming French culture at the time, both literary and musical. And it is something that was especially propagated by Victor Hugo. And what it is sort of there are two sides to this coin. There's an intellectual exploration of the other being, of course, the cultural other, that essentially the East was viewed as this utopia, this kind of interesting projection that the French used as a mirror to themselves, something that they wanted to emulate, something that acts as a mirror to the idea of Western rationality, that the East is seductive, it's feminine, it is mysterious, it's inscrutable. What winds up happening, of course, is the political will to control, to mythologize, to exploit that otherness, that difference, the assertion of power that, in fact, the French are may have lost certain things in becoming rational, in becoming this hegemony, but in fact that they are ultimately superior, and this doubling, this sort of simultaneous elevation of the East and denigration of the East is an important component to this opera and to this story. What's also interesting is that in this opera, because it is about Carmen and her cohorts, who are all gypsies, is that gypsies and Jews were part of this Orientalist fad, but in a very different way, because whereas Moors or the North Africans or the Middle East, the Arabs were viewed in this sort of positive light, Jews and gypsies were viewed with scorn and with distrust, with bigotry, and of course with very active malice, because they, unlike the other societies, have infiltrated Western society and were viewed as dangerous others. And this becomes again very important for Carmen in particular. These Orientalist ideas were very much explored in opera prior to and after Carmen. So Sasson has a Samson and Delilah opera. Massenet wrote Thais. Delibes wrote Lakmé. These are all the same type of culture, cultural interest that they had. And in addition, also, of course, the femme fatale model would have been one that would have been very familiar to Bizet when he was writing this opera. And as I mentioned, this initial performance of the opera was a total failure. And the reason for that is that the story contains this moral impropriety which would have been totally inappropriate for opera comique. And what I mean by moral impropriety is the sort of blatant female sexuality that was depicted, the fact that there is a murder, the fact that there is a depiction of so-called lowlives. We have the gypsies, lower class, working people, and also the fact that the music that is written in Bizet's score is music from the music halls, from the cabarets, from the sort of seedy underlife that Bizet liked to explore, that was sort of baked into the opera. All of these would have been taboo and very much not appreciated in the opera comique stage. As I mentioned as well, though, outside of France, it was a huge success. Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Wagner, and in fact Nietzsche all approved of and admired the opera enormously. And the reason for that is that the reason they were able to see beyond what was so offensive to opera comique concert goers was that there was no cultural baggage associated with these taboo subjects. And as I also mentioned, the opera was eventually accepted and was celebrated long after Bizet's death. So the libretto and plot were written by Henri Meillac and Ludovic Halévy, who were the very accomplished librettists, worked with Offenbach a great deal, and this is actually considered one of the finest librettos ever written for an opera, and for good reason. For those of us who may not have seen the opera or just need a refresher on the synopsis, we open in Spain, where Don José, soldier, is sort of minding his own business, and he encounters Carmen, who, along with the other workers that she works with in a cigar factory, it catches his attention. Meanwhile, Micaela, a sort of hometown girl from where he's from, appears and brings a message from his mother, and he is sort of assumed to be in love with Micaela, and it is assumed that they will be married. All of a sudden, Carmen is apprehended for slashing a woman's face in the factory that she's working at because she's accused of being a prostitute, or insinuated that she's a prostitute. And this is an important part of this dynamic, is that all of these characters in this opera, except for Don José, view Carmen as a prostitute. And Don José is instructed to hold Carmen to keep her in a holding cell, and she ultimately seduces him, and he releases her. He is then in turn punished when we come into Act 2. He's imprisoned for a month for releasing her. She meets with her gang of smugglers who she works with, and they try to convince her to leave with them, but she tells them that she's in love with Don José. But they know better than that, because they say, no, we know that you have these flings, and you're going to be back with us any old time. Don José turns up to their lair, and professes his love for Carmen, who says, you don't love me, you actually are just, a goody two-shoes trying to go back. You're always leaving me for the army. You're never actually paying attention to me. Come, join me, and we will live this life of freedom together as gypsies. And meanwhile, Escamillo, the toreador, has been introduced to Carmen, and she has made a pass at her. She takes notice. Ultimately, Don José chooses to abandon his military post and joins Carmen along with all the other gypsies, and we come into Act 3, where the relationship is not going well. She says, you're simply not cut out for this way of life. Go home. And he refuses. He says, you must come with me or I will stay with you. At which point Micaela comes back and tells Don José that his mother is dying. And so he must return home, and promises to come back for Carmen, who's sort of like, yeah, right, whatever, I don't care, get out of here. And in Act 4, she has finally met up with Escamillo, they've declared love for one another, and she knows that Don José is coming for her. So she chooses, despite her friends protesting, to meet with him. And she tells him that she no longer loves him, that their relationship is over. And he, in turn, realizing that he can no longer have her, does the rational thing, which is he murders her. So that is more or less what was actually considered, funnily enough, back then, a complicated plot behind this opera. And it was premiered, as I said, in 1875 at the Opera Comique. It's a fairly large romantic orchestra, double winds with the flutes doubling on piccolo, one of the oboes doubling on English horns, trumpets, trombones, harp, strings, and notably quite a large percussion setup, because one of the important things we're going to discuss is that one of the ways that a composer, when writing an Orientalist work, the one way that they can indicate that is by using exotic sounds. So one of the ways that we can sort of unpack the way that Bizet wrote Carmen is from three main musical features. First of all, there's this idea of symmetry and transgression. Music at the Opera Comique would have been expected to be very sort of regular, very sort of harmonically structured in this very predictable, very, you could almost say facile manner, in a learned style, and what was expected if you were a good French composer and you wrote in a very good French way. But what happens is that there are all sorts of elements, especially elements associated with Carmen, that are unconventional, that are unpredictable, that have excessive dissonance or that have excessive chromaticism. And we hear that very clearly in the prelude, where there are two types of music. There's the music associated with the toreadors, let me see, I hope you can hear this. And then there's also the music that is associated with Carmen. This type of back and forth is what makes for such a dramatic opening in the prelude. So we're going to listen to that right now. And you'll hear the back and forth between, again, this sort of almost banal music. Bizet has a quote regarding the most famous aria, the Toreador song, saying essentially, they want trash? Well, fine, I'll write trash for them. So let's see. So this very abrupt switch from this sort of, again, this sort of the cheerful music of the Toreadors to the suddenly very melodramatic, harmonically unstable music is a key part of this whole opera. And this back and forth is an element of that. So one way that he tries to communicate these transgressive ideas is, of course, through the use of Orientalist music. And the question is, how do we portray these elements? So, for the most part, there are two ways of doing that. First, you can source actual music. And that is true of exactly two of the numbers where Bizet either likely or did study particular musics to imitate that style. So, of course, we have the habanera from Act 1, Carmen's very, very famous aria. And that is an Afro-Cuban type of music, which, of course, is not necessarily stylistic, rather true to where this takes place. Of course, as I said, it's an Afro-Cuban dance, but this is a story set in Spain. But the fact is that doesn't matter. It's more what's important is that it is an evocation of a certain other culture, right? So this habanera has a couple of things. First of all, it has this hypnotic dance rhythm. And on top of that, it has this chromatic melody. I can't play it very well, but you get the idea. There's this descending line. And what these two things would signify to an audience are not only that there's this sort of sexual element, or rather, it's not just an unstable element, this sort of hip swinging rhythm on top of this sort of unstable melodic element, the chromatic part, is that there's a sexual element to this. This music, of course, sounds like this, and I'm sure you'll all recognize it because it is arguably the most famous, or at least one of the two most famous parts of this opera. Another example of this use of sourcing is actually from the Act 4 entr'acte, this orchestral interlude, which sources Andalusian music, specifically the polo, which is a type of, I believe, flamenco dance that would have indicated, again, very obviously very Spanish. Now, what is notable about this particular excerpt is the use of tambourines, use of percussion instruments that signify sort of an exotic flair, an exotic color that are associated with the dance music of these various regions. On top of that, the prominence of woodwinds, these, especially the oboe playing the melody. So that would indicate again sort of the evocation of ethnic instruments. What is also important, and this is moving beyond just the sourcing of music, but the tropes that are associated with music from other countries. So, of course, there's the dance rhythms that I mentioned. There's the percussion, the use of exotic percussion instruments, the unusual instrumentation, and also the sort of simple musical structure, the sort of more regular type of music that would have been associated with not intellectual, non-Western, because Western music, of course, is prized or was prized because of its complexity. These sort of paring down of the music. And of course, there's also the harmonic tools that you can use to indicate that, because there's a dissonant interval that is avoided in most Western music, the interval of the augmented second, which when I play it in context, let's say we have a D minor scale without the augmented second. happens is that in an imitation of Eastern music, there's this dissonant interval thrown in. It's that up here. This is, and of course you hear it in the in this melody. And same with this little fate motive at the beginning. These are things that would have been completely synonymous with evoking the East. On top of that, we also have the seguidilla, which would have been, this is again something where, which is a type of, I should explain, is a type of Spanish dance that Carmen uses to seduce Don José in the first act. There's all sorts of interesting harmonic colors and chromaticism that she uses, or rather that Bizet uses, and then therefore Carmen uses to seduce and to ensnare Don José. So this type of music is closely identified with not only Orientalism, with the evocation of the East, but also with the dangers of associating with especially women from these other cultures. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, there we go. So on the other hand, in contrast to this music, this seductive music, we have Micaela's music, which would be much more of the sort of standard opera comique stock. So we have this much more placid, chaste music that is associated with her, as we see in this duet between Don José and Micaela. Again, you get the idea. This sort of very, again, chaste, domicile woman that is much more what sort of the virtuous person that is intended to be portrayed in opera comique, in this much more sort of is as a contrast rather to Carmen. Another, of course, musical element that we explore with Carmen is the fact that most of her music and most of the music associated with the gypsies is basically cabaret music, which gives the impression that Carmen is always performing, that she is always sort of never actually genuinely herself. It's hard to know what is sincere. And what this creates, especially when we consider the music of Micaela, is that there's this dialogue between high art, between music of the opera comique and degraded music, music of the Orientalist genre, music of the music halls of cabaret. And again, this symmetry versus the transgression is the focal point of the opera, is sort of this always raising the sort of question, as it was in the novella, of who is dominant, who is in control. And ultimately, what happens, of course, is that Carmen is murdered, and this sort of this forced ending, this forced destruction of Carmen, it is a sort of a closure, right? It is the ultimate closure for her and for Don José, but is it really necessarily, a fulfilling or at what cost does this closure come? Because the ultimate sort of transgression that happens is that Don José is essentially corrupted. He is transformed into this crazy delinquent. And what happens is that we're sort of assumed, reading it from an 19th century perspective, to assume that the violence that is committed against her is understandable, that it is relatable, that it is justified, that his dream of possessing her, of redeeming her, is basically a fool's errand, and that his action, his ultimate murder of her, is the only way that you can control the situation, the only way that you can understand, the way to sort of come to terms with what has happened. And Micaela, in a certain way, actually also supports this, because as opposed to Carmen, she is sort of this assurance of male dominance, of domesticity. And what we see in Carmen is sort of this, I guess you could say, triple threat of sort of the worst elements that you could see in a human. First of all, that she is lower class, that she's a gypsy, and that she is a woman. She is the ultimate threat in terms of racial, class, and gender lines. And not only that, she's also endowed with male characteristics in that she is, or rather male, quote unquote, in that she's intelligent, that she's resourceful, that she is able to blend and blur class, gender, and race lines, in that she is comfortable in all situations. She's comfortable speaking with the soldiers. She's comfortable speaking with the other women. She's comfortable speaking with men. She's able to cross these class lines and interact with people comfortably, whereas, say, Don José is unable to fit in with the gypsies. And not only does this make her dangerous because she is transgressing the rational world as perceived by the French, but also her sexuality is sort of the ultimate flaw. What's important to remember here is that women from other cultures were viewed as available and uninhibited to men, to especially men of France. And also important to remember that prostitution was rampant in 19th century France because of the issues of poverty. And as a result, also venereal disease was something that was sort of high on the mind for men of good repute who are perhaps spending a lot of time at houses of ill repute. This makes Carmen, her sort of dangerousness, her malice, essentially, that is baked into her character, the most dangerous possible threat to men everywhere. And again, this is reading it from a 19th century interpretation. And it is interesting as we move into the 20th and then now the 21st century, rereading how we talk about this opera, because of course this is an extremely antiquated and extremely unpopular way of depicting women who are not white, depicting people of lower classes. And what winds up happening is this monster or martyr dichotomy. Instead, many readings today, we choose to reread these characters, that in fact it is not Don José who is the victim in this situation. It is actually Carmen who is the victim, that it is Don José who is the nut job and not Carmen, who is basically a vampire, who is preying on men and on people to basically move out of the way of her path of destruction. So it's just it's a fascinating opera in this way, and many operas we actually have to accommodate for the fact that the views and the things expressed in the opera, the sort of moral lessons that we're supposed to learn, may not actually be applicable anymore. And it's interesting in a flexible opera like this, and a successful, beautiful, and incredibly dramatic and sort of deeply emotional opera like Carmen, to reread and rethink how we deal with art and how we sort of move beyond the original intentions of an opera. And to me, that's what makes this opera ceaselessly fascinating. It certainly has earned its place as one of the greatest operas ever written. So I will leave it there. While I'm here, I'm going to just see if there are any questions that might be that you might have. This is our last class, so I will be in touch. Certainly, we're planning a new class. We're sort of toying with a couple of ideas. Thinking of doing more opera in the 21st century, just more broadly speaking. Also thought of perhaps just selecting a few pieces and sort of just doing a masterworks program where we sort of delve into a particular piece, a particular composer. If you have any opinions on this, please feel free to reach out. If there's anything that you'd like to hear, things that you'd like me to explore, questions you might have, please feel free to contact me. I think that is all. So thank you all for all of you who've been here for the whole series. It's been a lot of fun, and I will hope to see you soon to talk about more music. Have a good night, everybody.